All right, let's do her. Page 5, third paragraph down, talking about the genealogy of Jesus. So as you may remember, there are quite a few genealogies in the Bible. Genealogy is simply a means of tracing or tracking various families, and of course the main interest is to record the line of promise. So the ones in Genesis, and then in Numbers, and then again in Joshua and in Chronicles, the main purpose is to get us to where we're at, which is the Messiah, Jesus. Concerning the genealogy of Jesus, it must be noted that those in Matthew and Luke differ in a number of places. If you haven't noticed that before, it's a fact. If you don't let that bother you, because there's a reason for that, which we'll get into in a minute. The coming together at Shatiel and then differing again. The lists in Luke and First Chronicles also differ. So when you compare the family lines in the New Testament with those in the Old Testament leading to Jesus, there are some different names there. For whatever reason, the Holy Spirit decided to include certain people and exclude others. So none of the genealogies are complete. We know that. The one probably in Genesis is the closest, the one before the flood. That's probably the closest to being not skipping any generations. But again, God does not have to, and chose not to, make them complete. Some generations are just left out, pure and simple. It skips from a father down to great-grandson or grandson. And God decides to do that for his own reasons, whatever. The lists, but they are like in a few generations immediately before Jesus. And that's pretty much true if you're looking at Matthew or Luke and then you're comparing them in the Old Testament. You can usually find enough information as you get closer and closer to Christ that is pretty much the same. Family lines could be traced in a number of ways. It's important also to remember. A family could marry priestly women. So let's say you always married a Levite. No matter what your tribe was, if you married a Levite woman, then that you would get into the Levite line, and the Levite line was traced more carefully, that and in Judah more carefully than others, for the simple reason that Levites, of course, are the priests, and the line of Judah was recognized eventually as going to be the line of the promise. Hold public trusts and posts, participate in religious ceremonies, and so on, and thus the names would be preserved and the direct line of the Messiah preserved. So this is often the way it happened. You had people in the line of Judah marrying people from the line of Levi, and therefore the names would be recorded because they were involved in the temple worship or other important duties. As for those who were not part of the court or religious leaders of some sort, there were a few legitimate trades practiced. Okay, now going on to trades. Some have already been mentioned, but there were many despised trades. So there were trades that were considered to be unclean. Any trades notorious for leading to dishonesty, these including physicians, shopkeepers, caravan leaders, and of course tax collectors. Other trades also brought no special blessing, such as small cattle breeders, sellers of purple, and cutters of trees. Repugnant trades are those that dealt with refuses or those that involved women. So if you were in the job of collecting garbage, if you were in the job of cleaning out horse stalls and such, you would be, or in dealing with sick women especially, you were considered to be unclean. There were numerous varieties of slavery in Israel. Exferto, which is a Latin term, became slaves because they could not pay for stolen goods. So these were thieves that were caught and did not have the money to recompense the victim, and so they became slaves. Ex concessu were those who sold themselves into servitude voluntarily for some reason, usually because they needed the money. That's usually the reason. Patria potestas were young Israelite girls contracted for marriage later in life. So sometimes this wasn't a betrothal so much as it was a selling to get the dowry. By law, slaves must serve only 6 years. This, like other laws in Israel, was not observed. So even though they were supposed to be released after 6 years, very few were, if any. Legally, they were property of their masters, so they did not have any rights of their own. But it was more like privileged servants or hired servants until the debts were paid off. So they were treated like workers usually. So when you hear Paul or Jesus talk about slaves, don't think of plantations and people being whipped and beaten and all that, or even in Roman slaves, like rowing in galleys and things like that. Jewish slaves were much more like common servants. These laws were almost universally ignored. The Jews, as we have mentioned, never observed the Jubilee years, never observed the Sabbath years, never observed the freeing of the slaves, as I mentioned, things like that. They just didn't pay attention to those laws, even though they were very picky about other laws. The fact of the matter is, the Jews, from the time of the captivity, well, really from the time of Joshua until the time of Jesus and even afterwards, were pick and chose what laws they wanted to keep and which laws they didn't want to keep. And for many of them today, it's the same way. Samaritans, let's move on, were looked on as Gentiles. Even though they had Jewish blood, they were of mixed race, and so they defaulted to being looked at as Gentiles and pagans. So marriage with them was possible, although there was some relaxation of the restrictions in the time of Herod. Maybe that's supposed to be impossible. Sorry about that. Should be impossible. Sorry. Was impossible. They're not supposed to marry a Samaritan. But there was a relaxation during the time of Herod, because Herod himself was an Idumean. He wasn't a pure Jew himself. And he married a Samaritan. But most often there was hostility and bitterness between the Jews and Samaritans, which, you can tell from the Bible stories. They were seen as impure and causing impurity just by associating with them. So if you just walked through Samaritan territory, you were unclean. If you bought something from a Samaritan, you were unclean. If you talked to a Samaritan, you were unclean. If you touched a Samaritan, you were unclean. Okay. Women, talk about them for a minute. Women's position in society, even among the rulers, was quite low. They had almost no part in public life and were to remain unobserved, preferably not to go out at all. This was fairly common throughout that part of the world, even long before Mohammedanism, Islam. Remember, Islam does not come into the picture until 600 years after Christ. So wearing veils or even wearing total body coverings was long tradition, long before Muhammad was even born. So the rules that are in Islamic societies and Sharia law did not originate with Muhammad or the Quran or the Hadith or any of those. They originated in the culture itself going back thousands of years. Queen Alexandria, Salome, and others broke these ideas and took leadership places. Many women could not keep to a stern seclusion, especially for economic reasons, since many of them worked with their husbands. So again, this is a law that was not always observed. At betrothal, the Jewish woman was really receiving a new master, but one who might, notice might, treat her better than her family. Girls, women, females were seen of as property. You were considered cursed, a cursed man, if all you had was daughters, or if you had many daughters and maybe one son. You were considered cursed by God because they would not, unless you were real fortunate, bring you much, especially in the middle class or poor families. Couldn't get much for them. And so the position of women, again, long before Christianity, long before Islam, was pretty miserable, was pretty low, with some very rare exceptions. The father could marry off the daughter when she was very young, usually at puberty, although marriages might be arranged soon after weaning. Was common in Israel the time of Jesus. After a child was weaned, and maybe another year or two to see if they survived. It was not always hard to survive when you were still nursing, although a lot of children died during their weaning years or during their nursing years. But then after they were done with that, usually they were weaned not because they were ready or because, but because they had to. Usually they were weaned because the mother had to go back to work or work more often or more strenuously, or because she was pregnant again. And this was fairly common. So the old saying used to be, during the Middle Ages, for example, or even in our country in the 1800s, 1900s, was that when you were nursing, you couldn't get pregnant again. That's not true. It happens, and many women in America in the 1800s and early 1900s used that as a form of birth control, and so that's why maybe some of your ancestors, maybe some of your close relatives, great-grandparents or whatever, may have been nursing when they were 4 or 5 years old. That's why. Usually up to 2 and 3, but that's why. Because it was seen as a form of birth control. But as I say, it didn't always work. Matter of fact, it's less than 50% effective. So there were a lot of children born, and then you're born and you're getting ready to take care of another one. It's difficult sometimes to wean, to nurse 2 or 3, certainly, and so on. So that's why many of them were weaned. But so right after the weaning, right after age like 3, 4, 5, right in there, then the family that had the daughter would try and make an arrangement with somebody with a son about that same age, or maybe up to 10 years older, so that they could know for sure that they had a place to go. When they reached puberty, then the husband, who again could be anywhere from 5 to 10 years older, would just come and get the daughter, as you see in the bridal parties and the parables of Jesus. And so there are no wedding ceremonies. Remember that. There are no wedding ceremonies. Wedding ceremonies are very, 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 very recent. Wedding ceremonies date from, in royalty in the Middle Ages, but among the common people, there were no wedding ceremonies until you get into the late 1800s, and early 1900s. It's very recent in history. Weddings, except again for royalty, among the common people were very quick, efficient affairs. Boom, boom, you know. Say I do, okay, you're done. Have a nice day. It was not a big deal at all. Oh, question.
Yeah, my question is, what was the rush on this? Why did have his daughter, you know?
You wanted to know that there was a place for your daughter. You did not want to have to feed that mouth any longer than you absolutely had to. You see, the son at an early age, already 8, 9, 10, could begin learning a trade and therefore begin doing work and compensate the family for his keep. Or even doing chores. Chores were, in those days, extremely difficult. They involved a lot of heavy lifting. And as we know, upper body strength is not a thing. It's not something that women have normally. And so if you don't have upper body strength to lift and all this kind of stuff, it would be very difficult for you to be useful to your family. About the best that girls could do would be to carry water, and as you know, water is very heavy. But then, of course, they had pots they carried on their head, which they were able to do, and also boards with 2 water pots on each side that they were able to do. But even that, they were able to carry only about half as much water as their mother or brother. So the point was that if you had a bunch of daughters, you had a lot of mouths to feed, and mouths that were not going to contribute to the family in most cases.
Yeah,
because
all the work that they had to learn to do as far
they didn't learn to do any work.
They
learned to sew. Okay, they learned to sew. You know, they learned to, I guess, knit. I suppose you could say, and crochet. I suppose whatever. Learn to cook, certainly. But you had mom for that most of the time. You didn't need a whole bunch of girls to do these things in most cases.
Well, if you have 10 kids, I'll tell you what, you'll want some help cooking.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's true. But in general, these were just empty mouths that you had to feed, and you weren't going to get much back from them. So they were not thought of as blessings. They were thought of as curses, and that's just the way it was. And so if at 3, 4, 5 you could make a deal with another guy saying, he had a son, and of course he wanted to have children, especially sons, and so he wanted to know that his boy had a girl to count on when he got to age, when he finished his internship, for example. Okay, and usually that took place around the age of 20. Okay, 20, 21, somewhere around in there, 18 to 20. You wanted to know that he had a wife waiting for him. And so you would make a deal with this guy who had a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, and then wait until she gets to be 12 or 13, till she becomes able to have children. And then, okay, as soon as he had a place of his own, as soon as he was making his way in the world, go get your wife. Get out of my house, go get your wife, and start your own life. Life was hard, folks. Up until very recently, life was hard. I would say, if you want a number, really, especially among the poor, among the common people, you could say life was tough until the 1950s. Until you got a bunch of washing machines, and dishwashers and ironing, irons and vacuum cleaners and a bunch of other stuff. But really in the 30s, my goodness, people were still having 10, 12 kids, and half of them were dying before they hit, teenagehood. And you can just go back from there, 30s, 20s, teens, 1890s, 1880s, and keep going right back to the Middle Ages. And life was not much better throughout any of that. You still had outhouses, you still had diseases and plagues running through the countryside. You still had hard work. You didn't have electric lights. You couldn't stay up at night. You couldn't produce anything at night. Factories couldn't run at night. And so factories had to run 7 days a week during the daylight. And kids were going to work on factories when they were, 6, 7, 8 years old. You've heard stories of some of these factories in the East Coast, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, big fires taking place in these factories, and hundreds of children dying. Because they were on the 7th floor or whatever. Folks, I'm telling you, you really don't realize. Those of you born in the 40s and 50s, especially after the war, you don't realize that you really, myself and same generation, baby boomers, really the first generation that had it halfway decent. And in many cases, you could say probably better than the ones after, too, in many ways. So life really didn't change that much. From the time of Jesus till after the Second World War, life was pretty much the same. I mean, it was improved a little bit here and there, but for most things, no. Before steam power, before electric power, and all that kind of stuff, life was a bear. And a lot of young people did not survive. Yes, ma'am.
Well, surely back in this time, God couldn't have looked favorably on women's position at that time.
No, I wouldn't say that. But there is, let's put it this way, God is a realist. And in his commands to the Jews, which is all we can really go by, in the Levitical law, he doesn't say a lot to change the situation. He certainly doesn't tell people to treat their daughters lousy. He doesn't say that. And there are a few laws in Levitical laws where, for example, when polygamy, he tells men that they must treat their second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth wives the exact as equals to their first wife, which is unheard of in the laws of that ancient world. Unheard of. You treated your wives however you wanted to. And if you wanted to treat the 7th one better than the first one, or the first one better than the 10th one, that was your business. God made it very clear in the Moses Law that you were supposed to treat all of them the same. Which is also why Muhammad, when he invented, and he did invent, he invented Islam, he capped polygamy at 5. You're supposed to have no more than 5. Now, a lot of the sheiks and stuff have more than that. But in Islam, it's supposed to be a rule that you stop at 5 wives, because it was felt that a man could not take care of more than 5 wives equally. Okay. So yeah, ladies, boy, you've come a long way, baby. Oh yeah, well yeah, it's still that way in Africa and Asia. It's still that way, of course, in all Muslim countries. It's still that way. Afghanistan and places like that. Women don't go to school when the Taliban, rules. Yeah, Hindus are that way. Women are to have babies. Women are to cook. Women are to make clothes. Maybe work on the fields if they're strong enough. But that's it. That's it. That's it. They're not supposed to do anything else.
I don't think God instructed that they.
No, these aren't rules. These aren't rules from above. No, that's just
These
that.
are men that are
Yeah.
making these.
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, let's be fair. That the original intention. I mean, all you have to do is look at the physical bodies, and it's clear that the original intention before the fall was that men be heads and women be helpers. And they're created in such a way. Women's bodies are created to bear children, obviously, okay, and then nurture them, obviously. Their emotions, their feelings, their sensitivities are towards children, kindness, patience, whereas the fathers are, get the belt out and beat the snot out of them and get them in line. And so, that division of labor, that division of responsibilities, that division of work is God ordained. It is. Certainly the treatment, however, is not God ordained. Okay, that comes from the fall. Okay, that comes from the fall. It's a consequence of the fall. All right. In marriage, the duties of the wife are primarily household and family duties, primarily. Now, if a man wanted his wife to work with him or needed his wife to work with him, it's a two-handed, four-handed operation, such as cloth dyeing, for example, coloring cloth or other things. That was common to do. Polygamy was permissible in Israel and freely practiced by the upper classes. So women had to prepare to share the husband and home. This was common in the upper middle class. Of course, again, here again, economics play into it. This is another mouth to feed. This is another person. And yes, this person might produce more children for you, but then, she can also, you don't know, she might produce a whole bunch of daughters and then you're in deep doo-doo, okay? So the idea was that, if you wanted a second wife, you could have one, or a third one, or a fourth one. But in most cases, the say 3, 4 up in there, that was only rich people could afford to do that. The common people, the working class, they couldn't afford more than one, frankly, in most cases. Divorce was largely a man's right, although a woman could get one arranged, but with very great difficulty. All a man had to do to divorce a wife was to place her shoes, mostly it was her shoes or sandals, because that's all it would be, and clothing and other personal items outside the door of the home and attach a note to the door telling people that she was no longer to be considered his wife. That's all you had to do. Okay? So you find her shoes, and she's not going to be like Imelda Marcos. She's not going to have 5 closets full of shoes. She's going to have 1 pair, maybe 2 if she's lucky. And you put those outside the door, and if she had a favorite pot that she cooked in, or one that she considered, brought from her family, as part of her dowry or whatever, take that, also whatever extra shift she had or rags that she had to wear, stuff that in there, set it outside the door, write a note, she's not my wife anymore. Tack it to the door. I don't know if I could not find out if there was a time period on it, how long you had to leave it out there or whatever. I don't know. All you had to do is post it. I'm not sure there was any time to it. And that was it. She was on her own. And most of them couldn't go back to their families because, the old man had gotten rid of her in the first place. And, so she would not be welcome going home to mom and dad at all. And where's she going to go? What's she going to do? Well, she could be a beggar. Most of them went into prostitution. That was the only way they could survive. Or as I say, a begging. The older ones, the ones that were older when they were thrown out, they became beggars. And some of them went to the temple, like, the lady in the temple, and go there and just serve in the temple. But even that, you could only serve certain parts of the temple, because you couldn't even go into other places of the temple. So it was tough. It was hard. It was really hard. And again, that's a true right up through the 1940s in pretty much most parts of the world. Next page. Generally, next page. Women in such situations were forced to turn to prostitution for survival, and other older ones became common beggars. The accounts of Jesus' somewhat tolerant attitude towards such women. Jesus was very, very kind to women. This was noted by his enemies. Don't think it wasn't. They noted this. And for that reason, he was considered weak. And he was also, one of the reasons he was considered to be unlawful is because he gave great deference to women. He allowed these women to touch him. He is a bachelor still, and he allowed these women to touch him, put perfume on him, put perfume on his feet, run over him with their hair, this kind of stuff. This was all verboten. You weren't supposed to do this. And so Jesus' close interaction with these women, speaking to them kindly, helping them when he could, saying nice things about them, whatever. This was just, this was brand new. This was not, and frankly, was not carried on unfortunately, by many of his followers afterwards. They were pretty much products of their culture.
Was the men's affairs that they have with these prostitutes considered sinful?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was. It was not. It was considered normal. It was considered something usual that you wouldn't make a big fuss about, but it was not considered good or right. It was considered something where you kind of go to the temple and you can make restitution to God and move along. The attitude is much like you find in many countries, third world countries that are still heavily influenced by Romanism. In Mexican, Hispanic societies and other parts of the world where Romanism rules still, Philippines, for example, which are not technically Hispanic, of course, even though they speak Spanish. The idea is simply this, and I heard this from my own fellow workers when I worked in the ranch, in the fields with the field workers. One of the things my dad insisted on is that I work with the poor people, that I work with the common folks, and I did. I worked 8 years in a shoveling crew, hoeing crew, with very poor men or men who just didn't have a whole lot of gumption. And so they took the easiest job, not easiest physically, but easiest mentally to do. I knew guys on the shoveling crew that were in their 50s and 60s, but could out-shovel a teenager. Anyway, listening to them talk during lunch, it was very common to hear them say, oh yeah, they went to town Saturday night, had a good time with Rosita or Pablita or, Bonita or, whatever. And then went to confession, and got it taken care of and then went to mass the next day on Sunday.
Means you wonder about diseases.
Well, yeah, but strangely enough, it's interesting in Mexico and in South America and in certain other parts of the world, Roman Catholic world, syphilis and gonorrhea and other sexually transmitted diseases, STDs as they call them, were not as prevalent as they were in Europe. They were much more prevalent in Europe. I'm not sure. I've never done a study on it to see why that is, or has anybody figured out why that was. But England, wow, England was devastated. Once, and syphilis, interesting thing about syphilis is, we think syphilis has been around for thousands of years, but it didn't really take off. It didn't really become a plague until the early Middle Ages. 1300s, and
back to the Roman Empire, and the Roman soldiers and the sheep.
yeah, once you get into the 12 and 1300s, there you have it among the soldiers in many cases and among some of the middle class merchants, but not in epidemic numbers. You don't really get epidemic numbers until the 12 and 1300s, and they're starting in Italy. It really ravaged Italy, really ravaged France, Germany, and boy, when it got to England, man, I mean, every other person, literally, just about every other person had syphilis. And they dig up bodies nowadays they find these graveyards. They want to put a mall there, or a parking lot or whatever, and so they dig up these graves. They even found this last one just a few months ago. They were digging up a place and they found the foundations of an old monastery. And they went to the graveyard of the monastery and they dug up all these priests, and like 75% of them had syphilis. So it really, and this was in England, it really hit English society hard. They called it the pox because when you get syphilis, a lot of times in the later stages, you get pox, large pox, pustules all over yourself. And you could always tell. And if somebody managed to survive for a while, these would heal up, you would see scars. And there's drawings and pictures of people in England from the 13, 14, 1500s, and you see these scars on their faces and on their arms and legs very often. So yeah, it was considered, in Luther's day, for example, it was considered normal. One mayor of a town wrote to Luther after early in the Reformation. He said, Luther, you were right. People were taking advantage of the indulgences and penance, and so they were committing lots of sins and then just doing confession and then right back to the sins again. And so, you're right to point that out, and you're right that we need to clean up our lives. And so he said, in our town, for example, we closed down all the brothels. We closed down all the whorehouses. And in that town, I think he said there were 5. He said, it wasn't a very big town. A town of a couple thousand guys, and they had 5 whorehouses. So anyway, he said, we closed down all the whorehouses, he said, but now we have a problem. Now we have, in the early morning, as you can imagine, milkmaids, which was the lowest position you could have as a peasant person. And again, because that was few things that women could do, was milk cows, or girls could do. Most of these were unmarried girls. And they would go out, they would leave their little hut in the early morning, like before dawn, because the cows, of course, have to be milked, right away in the morning, and get that good milk, and maybe also twice a day. Not often in those days, because of the feed was not as good as our feed today. Today you milk cows twice a day. Back then maybe not. But anyway, so in the early morning this girl would head out, go down to a barn. Maybe it was a common barn where families kept all their cows, or just a barn, across the way, across the alley or whatever. Anyway, she would be out and to milk the cow, and she would be accosted and raped. And so the mayor said to Luther, he said, we're having a real problem because a lot of our girls are being deflowered when they're out doing their milking chores. Mm-hmm. And of course, then they're not available for marriage. And of course, this is a great hardship then on the family. You can't marry their daughter off and get a dowry back for it, can't get any money for her if she's not a virgin. And so this is a huge problem. And so Luther wrote back to the guy, and he said, well, I sympathize with your position. Reopen one of the cat houses. That was Luther's advice. Reopen one of them. I mean, still keep preaching against it and teaching against it and whatever, but, just allow one of the houses to reopen, and that way, hopefully, you'll take care of the issue. Yeah.
Do you recall what the life expectancy was once you contracted that?
Syphilis was, there's no cure for syphilis. There was no cure for syphilis. There was no cure for syphilis until penicillin came along. And penicillin didn't come along until the 1800s. I would say 1820 maybe. Huh?
I was talking about back at that time.
In the 12 and 1300s, you would die. No question about it. It could go in remission though. It could go in remission, and your pox would dry up, and you would be relatively healthy. You were still a carrier, though. Uh-huh. But usually, what would happen is the bug or the germ is called a spirochete. That's the syphilis germ is called a spirochete, and the spirochete would eventually enter a vital organ. It would enter a heart, for example, and make holes in the heart. Would enter the lung and allow liquid into the lung. It would eat up your stomach, or eat up your liver, or eat up your kidneys. Worse yet, it would go to your brain and eat up your brain, and you become a moron. And there were lots of those, and then you didn't live very long after that. So I don't know if there was a general average number of years that these people lived. I didn't find, when I read about it, I didn't find anybody living more than 20 years, certainly. But then again, the life expectancy in the Middle Ages was about 40, 45 anyway, for the common people. Once in a while, you'll hear of somebody like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who didn't die until her 90s, late 80s, 90s, I believe. But in most cases, people, unless you were wealthy or royal, you very rarely would see anybody of the poor class to make 50. 50 was considered an old man. If you made 50, whoa, man, you really were blessed. But then the royals and those, they would make it further, but some of those not even much, you know. So, women were restricted to certain courts of the temple, although there were exceptions. But surprisingly, women were not separated from men in the synagogues as they are today. That's another interesting thing about Jews today. In Jesus' day and before and immediately after, women and men sat together in the synagogue. But when you get into the 400s or 500s and later than that, you see the synagogue separating men from women, and that remains true mostly in the Orthodox synagogues to this very day. So in that particular case, the position of women actually got worse, not better. Many disparaging opinions of women were voiced by religious teachers, but some glowing opinions were also expressed. Kind of depended on who you were. On rare occasion, a woman could rise to the level of teacher or even rabbi, which would be unthinkable in most synagogues today, except the most liberal. Now, in the Reform Judaism, you'll have women rabbis. We had a woman rabbi chaplain out here at Fort Huachuca I got to know fairly well. She was very, very devout, I would say, especially for a Reform Jew. She was very devout and very knowledgeable, very intelligent woman. I believe she was a captain in the chaplain corps. But that's only among Reformed Jews. Conservative Judaism, I do not think has women rabbis. I know Orthodox doesn't. The Hasidim or the ultra-Orthodox do not either. On the whole, the position of women was like that of the lowest class male in Israelite society, depending on a great deal on the status of her husband. Jesus taught a much higher estimation of women, and events connected with Jesus' life show this dramatic change. Jesus appeared first to women after his resurrection. Also, God used women to support Christ's ministry and in some cases even to teach later disciples about the gospel of Jesus. So you see a complete change, a complete 180-degree change with Jesus and Christianity. Now again, this does not mean that Christians in those cultures changed, even though they should have. The fact is, they did not in most cases. You have Aquila, Priscilla, you have some other cases, Eunice, Lois, a few other cases where women were treated very, very well, were thought of very highly, and so on and so forth. Lydia, the seller of purple, for example, and so on and so forth, even funded Christian congregations, but those were the exceptions. People who converted to Christianity pretty much stayed in their culture. And if their culture was looked down upon women, they didn't for whatever connect, somehow, for some reason, well, their culture, of course, did not connect Jesus' acts and his attitude toward women to be something they should imitate, unfortunately. Okay, let's talk about work a little bit. What kind of work did these people do? Jobs available in Israel during Christ's time, including working in wool, dyeing, weaving, fullers, leather, metalsmiths, also buying and selling of oil presses, bakers, butchers, water seller, and of course fishing. There were makers of ointments, rose perfumes, and those in arts and crafts, especially Greek and Roman, due to the influence of Herod. One of the most important were scriveners, that is, makers of scrolls and rolling them into a book. Okay? Scriveners, from which we get our word for Shrive Tuesday. Shrive Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. Scriveners comes from the same base word. Scriveners are those who are bookmakers. But of course, they didn't have books in those days, so they were scroll makers. Okay? So you took care of written records and you put these written records together in scrolls. Or you kept the scroll, the written record in a scroll, and you knew where it was, and you cataloged them and this kind of thing. And so they were very important. It was very important to have somebody around, especially if you're a wealthy person or somebody in government. It's good to have a scrivener who knows, okay, the rules about digging canals or this over here, pull it out and, or here's the blueprint of the temple, or, whatever. So These people, maybe we would call them clerks or librarians even. Those were very important people. As mentioned, Herod initiated many large and impressive building projects throughout his realm, and especially in and around Jerusalem. This created a great demand for workers of various trades, such as pavers, stonemasons, stone cutters, miners, craftsmen in tapestry, sculpturing, and the like. Most builders used stone, since wood was more expensive and often hard to come by. So carpenter, for Joseph, should be read as builder. There's a lot of debate recent decades about what was Joseph really? Was he really a carpenter? The word that's translated as carpenter can be translated in many ways. It can be translated simply as a craftsman. It can be also translated as a builder. And you could have a minor builder, such as a builder of pots and stools, or a builder of big furniture, or even a builder of houses. The fact of the matter is, most houses were built of stone, rocks and stone. You wouldn't, a house built of wood would be extremely expensive. As you may remember from your history, the land of milk and honey was not a land of milk and honey for very long. The land was denuded by constant warfare, constant invasions, constant battles, and so the hillsides were stripped bare of just about every tree except the olive tree, which continued to produce, of course. And if there were citrus trees, the only citrus trees in those days was something called a citron, and a citron grew about this big. And it had a very thick skin and not much pulp, not much fruit, very, very bitter, not used for much. The kumquat also was around in those days, which the skin, if you've ever eaten a kumquat, the skin is sweeter than the pulp. Most people don't find that out the hard way. We had a visitor once to our house. My dad, of course, kept every variety of citrus tree in his yard at the ranch, and we had a friend from New York visit us one time, and the kumquat tree was full and beautiful, beautiful little fruit. You've seen kumquat fruits; they're very small, like large grapes. And this kid picked one off and peeled it, and popped the flesh into his mouth, and oh man! And spit it out right away. And I said, now eat the peel that you just, oh no, I can't eat the peel, it's terrible. No, really, try it. And he ate the peel, and woo, that's pretty good. So a kumquat is exactly the opposite of lemon and orange. You eat the peel, not the fruit, not the pulp. So they had kumquats and citrons around.
Throw the whole thing in your mouth and eat it and balance it.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, I've never tried that, but that I'm not brave enough to try that. But in any case, wood was hard. Wood was impossible to come by. You had to import the wood. You had wood to the north in Lebanon. That was the closest. You didn't have any in Egypt. You didn't have any in Arabia. You didn't have any in Babylon. You didn't have any in Hittite lands. You didn't have any in Turkey up there, in Asia Minor. So if it didn't come from Lebanon, it had to come from across the Mediterranean, and that's really expensive. So wood, nobody had the money to build a wood house. You wouldn't see a wood house. Matter of fact, you saw very little wood. Everything was built out of stone. Jesus' manger, folks, was not wood. I can guarantee you that. His manger was a big stone with hollowed out for the feed. You put the animal feed in. That's what it was. It was not wood. The little manger that we have, that we put up at Christmas time, is not accurate at all. But the stone mangers probably weighed about 150 to 200 pounds, and would be tough to use those. So the houses were built of stone and reused, and mud, adobe. We would call it adobe. Mud bricks were fairly common. You would use then straw for the roof. Many homes had very little roofs at all. Unless you were well enough off, you could have a tile roof made of clay tile, baked clay tile. But even those were rare. So again, life was tough. Life was tough. Dirt floors for the most part, except if you were maybe a Roman or something, you might have a stone floor. Romans sometimes had indoor plumbing, had running water and lavatories, but that was pretty rare, very rare. So
Very common dirt floors in.
Yeah.
1955.
Yeah. Dirt floors are still common in Mexico. If you go down just across the border into Agua Prieta or San Luis or Tijuana or anywhere, you'll still find lots and lots and lots of dirt floors. Very common. Very,
Unbelievable how clean you can be in those.
that's true though. Yeah. These women with their brooms, you know, they clean it down to a kind of a hard type of floor, and then sometimes they sprinkle water on it and then they leave it.
Typical dirt floor, I know over in New Mexico, it's adobe,
Mm-hmm.
it's packed,
Mm-hmm.
and they go to the slaughterhouse and get bull
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
blood and put down on it, let it dry, crack, and fill in the cracks, and then they do it all over.
Mm-hmm.
again.
Mm-hmm.
That lasts about 10 years.
It does, yeah. Or unless you have a flood, you know, it lasts a long time, yeah. The people very ingenious after a while figured out how to do these things. More menial jobs were also essential, such as street sweepers, tomb guardians, funeral mourners, and the like. Doctors were considered common laborers and not held in high esteem, as were purveyors in leeches, bath attendants, circumcisers, and money changers. So these were jobs that existed, that a lot of people filled, and they were in demand, but the purveyors of these jobs were not thought of as good people. So, and you can understand that. If you are a moel, for example, a moel is a person that does circumcisions. If you're a moel, you deal in blood. You have to, because you cut. And therefore, as with anything else in those days, unless you're a priest who slaughters animals, you are unclean. The priests are not unclean when they slaughter animals for sacrifice, but everybody else is. Oh, and the reason is, they would be, but they make sacrifices for themselves ahead of time. So when you go on duty as a Levite in the temple, you make sacrifice for yourself for the fact that you're going to be dealing in blood. And then you make another sacrifice when your duty is done, and you go home clean. See?
So Luke was considered unclean most of the time.
Well, Luke was not a Jew; he was a Roman, and
I mean, according to the Jews.
yes, he was Gentile. He was Gentile, so he was unclean already. But Greeks and Romans, of course, thought highly of doctors. They thought, ever since Hippocrates, doctors had a much better reputation. Before Hippocrates, in Greece and Rome, the doctors were no better. But once Hippocrates got into it, and once they had the Hippocratic Oath, the doctors kind of felt, okay, we'll go by the rules. We don't want to, but we will. What about Jerusalem? A few more minutes here. The layout of the city included upper and lower city, divided by the Tifranian Valley, and two main market streets, the Cardo and the Decamano. Individual shops were distributed near the gates and along the main roads. The Cardo, related to Latin heart, as we at times use artery to describe a road, each quarter of the city also had its own bazaar. Trades were organized so that the craftsmen settled together in sectors to apply pressure to buyers and keep their trade secrets among themselves. So you had kind of unions, if you will, or maybe kind of like a lodge or craft lodge, like the stonemasons, and the wood carvers union or lodge. And now those words did not come in until much later in the Middle Ages in Western Europe. But here we did have these kind of groups that would, sometimes the Middle Ages you also hear the word guild, the Brewers Guild, and things like that. It would people, and so you would trade your secrets among them, but not let anybody else know. And if you wanted to join one of those groups, you had to go through certain things in order that they could trust you, that kind of thing. Temple trades were organized so that craftsmen were central. The main edifice was 46 years in building, from 17 BC until 30 AD. The whole complex was never totally finished. So the Jews could say, this temple Herod has been building on this temple, not him after he died, his sons on this temple for 47 years, whatever. But it really wasn't done yet. There were planned extensions and additions that were constantly being worked on right up to the day that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. The temple cultus continued until the temple was destroyed, with the service of bakers, temple physicians, and the like. Now again, in Jerusalem, this was the big deal, because this took up a lot of professions. This was a reason for a lot of tourist trade. This was a reason for a lot of people visiting Jerusalem, is to come and make sacrifice. And you didn't want to drag a sheep all the way from Rome. You were a Jew living in Rome in Jesus' day, you didn't want to drag a sheep all the way across the Mediterranean. You had to pay for the stupid thing to be on a ship. You didn't want that. And so you took your money, maybe you sold a sheep in Rome to somebody, a butcher, for whatever the price was. Let's say it's 10 denarii. Okay? You take that 10 denarii, you put it in your pocket, you buy a ticket for the ship, you take the ship, go across to Israel, go to Jerusalem. When you get to Jerusalem then you buy your sheep. But it wouldn't be 10 denarii, I can tell you that right now. It would be 20. Or maybe 30 or 40. And of course, they wouldn't take your Roman money. So you would take your Roman money and you would take it into the temple money changers, and you would say, I got 10 denarii, I want to buy a sheep. And the sheep over there are 30 denarii, so I need to start off with at least 10 here, and then I'll, or maybe you add your other Roman money to it, you add Roman money to it, and the Jew temple money changer there would say, well, so you got 40 denarii here in Roman money. Let's say I give you 30 Jewish shekels. Well, come on, let's make it, 35 at least. Nah, I don't think so, maybe 28. You want to keep bargaining, buddy? Where are you going to get your Jewish money to buy your sheep with? Or say you just want to make a donation. You can't put Roman money or Greek money or Byzantine or Babylonian money or Egyptian money. You can't put that in the temple treasury. That's like open up our box here, offering box, and finding a bunch of pesos in there, right? Not going to work, okay? So you had to exchange your money. So this was a big business. All these things were big, big business. Jerusalem itself was not on the major trade routes and was in fact a very poor location, frankly. As far as major cities of the world, you couldn't find a worse location. It was one of the worst. Didn't have a free-flowing river. Didn't have any cover. It was on a barren hill. The soil was rock. I mean, if this is the greatest spot on earth, good luck, Chuck. That's not. No nation or district trade put them on a map. If you would buy a map in Rome and look for Jerusalem, you wouldn't find it. You'd have to go to somebody, find a Jew, and say, if I'm going to Jerusalem, how do I get there? And they would put it on the map for you. Nobody put it on the map. It was considered a back alley, worse than a back alley. Okay, it's like Timbuktu. Whew. Matter of fact, Timbuktu in that day was much more prominent. It was known mostly for political and religious values, with great revenues coming from pilgrimages and temple revenues. Multitudes were drawn to the city from all over the world. This is because, of course, the Jews spread out, and so on and so forth. The temple merchants were respected since the high priest was over them. The camel caravans were protected as much as possible, with guards and forts along the way. Taxes and duty were charged at the roads. Market inspectors checked for price fixing that often occurred at the bazaars. They did have market inspectors, but they could be bought off pretty easily. Bribery was a big deal in those days. There was heavy trade with Greece and other places throughout the empire, Roman Empire, and a constant flow of people and materials back and forth from these places. There was wood from Lebanon, glass from Sidon, fish and slaves from Tyre, costly materials from Babylon, fabrics from India, spices from Arabia, and grain from Egypt. Those were the major imports. Grains from around Jerusalem supplied only a small portion of the need, again, because the soil was lousy. And so much of it came from Transjordan, that's across the Jordan River, in what we would call today the country of Jordan. Fruits and vegetables, mostly olives, figs, and dates, were abundant in and around Jerusalem. Livestock was a flourishing trade, as well as raw materials from the land, mostly stone and some wood. Every once in a while, a guy might cut down an old olive tree and use it for carving things, on making nice ornaments or making a stool or a chair, but that was pretty rare. Jerusalem was the center of the country, yet it was still remote, located in the highlands of Israel, and it took more work to move things in and out of the city. Still, it was the center of commerce for southern Palestine. The temple was its most important factor. Also, the demands of the king brought additional trade, since the city was the political center, but the pilgrimages brought in by far the most money. So it was a tourist trap. It was the ancient equivalent of Las Vegas. Well, yeah, Tombstone, Las Vegas. Okay? People came to just be there. And what happened in Jerusalem stayed in Jerusalem.
Nothing
They
has
didn't
changed.
have much wood. What did they use for heating at those times, you remember?
For what? For heating?
For heating, yeah.
Oh, sure, yeah. Oh, cow chips. Yeah,
Couch
that's the biggest. And that was quite, I didn't include it, but that was a big business. For you to go out and collect sheep dip, sheep dung and cow dung and camel
I
dung.
know there was buffalo chips. and
Yep,
stuff around here,
yep.
but,
That's what they lived on. That's what they fired their grills with. Boy, that gave your steak a nice taste in it.
I wonder when and how they figured that out, that it made a good fuel.
Oh, they've been doing that since they got out of the Garden of Eden. I'll leave the last section for next time, and we for sure will get into the thing. Now, here, let me take just a minute to tell you what my plan is here. Okay, here's my plan. If I was to give you every note that I have ever made on the Gospels, I would be giving you out about 250 pages. Okay, I'm not going to do that. Obviously, that would be a bit much for you to carry around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to read during the 2-week period that we're not meeting. Okay, ask you to read certain sections of Scripture. At least one, sometimes as many as 4 sections, because again, we're looking at all 4 Gospels. Feel free to write down any questions you have on those sections, or if you see something that you want to comment on, you say, oh, that's an interesting point that John makes or Mark makes. Write it down. When you get here, you'll have those, and we'll talk about those, and then I will add highlighted things that I have from my notes. I will add that, and then if you've looked, you can see that I give you some room. Again, if I give you a lot of room, this thing becomes big. But you have enough clear space there, you can make your notes. Okay? And so if you make 3, 4 notes per section, fine. 5 notes, 6 notes, maybe if you make them 2 columns, maybe. Depends on how big you write. That's the idea. And we talk about it until we have exhausted all of your questions, all of your comments, and all of my comments. All right? And once we do that, then we make a check in the box. We know we don't have to start there again. Right? And I'm going to try to keep it to 1 piece of the outline per session, if I can. So
for our next class, you want us to read the first?
if you would like to, sure. Read John 1 to 18.
Okay.
We're going to start out gentle. Okay? You don't get into 4 readings until, oh boy, go quite a ways. Till you get to the Sea of Galilee, point 16 on page 10. There you got 4 readings. But up until that point, there's 1, 2, or 3. And so I think it's doable, and I think we will make good headway. Otherwise, this thing will take us 10 years or more. So, okay?
Well, where did you get that?
You have it, yours,
Yeah, everybody has it.
Are we reading,
it's already done.
the
Oh, right
readings-
here.
Are we reading the readings under eternity, all of these, or just the first,
Just one.
just one?
Just point. We're good. The number, the Arabic numbers, the numbers are what we're going to do per session. All righty? You be excused.